Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. It's Monday, the 1st of February, and this is episode 105 of the Meet the Farmers podcast. I'm your host, Ben Eagle. Now, if you listened a couple of weeks ago, you will have heard the episode reviewing the Oxford Real Farming Conference, which this year went global for the first time, and there were dozens of speakers from across the world covering a range of different topics. At the conference, the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission launched their latest report, Farming for Change, mapping a route to 2030. And I'm delighted that for today's episode, we're discussing that very report with the FFCC's Chief Executive, Sue Pritchard, and the RSPB's Chief Executive, Becky Speight. Welcome to you both. Thanks for coming on. I should say, Sue, welcome back to the show, and Becky, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Be back.
Good. Sue, can we start with you? So last time you were on the show, we discussed your 2019 report, Our Future in the Land, which made 3 sets of recommendations. 1, healthy food should be everybody's business. 2, farming can be a force for change. 3, the countryside must work for all. Now, this report's a bit different. And you commissioned IDRI in France to work on modelling the potential for a brand new food system. So in true FFCC style, we're thinking big here. Can you summarise, and we don't have lots of time today, but can you summarise what the aims were for this latest report?
Quite rightly, people asked us a lot of questions after our 2019 report. A core recommendation of that was a transition to agroecology would be the most promising prospect for more sustainable farming systems in the UK. But people quite rightly asked us some probing questions about whether it was plausible, realistic, fair. Lots of people said, well, isn't that a kind of a niche proposition that you're describing there? Can it really feed the UK through that kind of agronomic approach? And so we thought we would ask that question. We would commission research to respond to that very valid question. Now, IDRI, the French think tank, had produced a very important piece of work called 10 Years for Agroecology for Europe. Published that in 2018, and we were very impressed with that piece of work. In fact, we used it to make our recommendations in our 2019 report. So we asked them to model an agroecological future for the UK, and that is what they did.
Yeah, I mean, can you talk us through the model itself for anyone who hasn't yet read the report or know of IDRI? What does the model itself look like in broad terms?
So first of all, it's important to say that the report that we launched, Farming for Change, is an interpretation of the IDRI paper. The IDRI paper is a very technical paper. It's a very dense paper. And even when we read it, it took several reads for us to get our heads around all of the implications of it, because it really is a very detailed, very comprehensive piece of technical modelling. And so that's why we produced our report, Farming for Change. It's an interpretation of the key questions that the IDRI technical modelling raises. But essentially, and my head of farming, Will Fraser, interpreted it for my benefit. He describes it as a kind of modelling modern mixed farming. So it's a set of questions that ask if you're farming more in harmony with nature, with much less chemistry, integrating livestock into your rotation, working with nature, so using natural systems for pest control and to improve fertility, what would that look like? But part of the question too is to make sure that such an approach also supported viable farming businesses, and also, an export capacity, UK export capacity. So we wanted to know that the model could feed the UK healthy, nutritious, sustainable food, but not at the expense of our own farming businesses, UK farming businesses, small, medium-sized enterprises all around the UK, not just perhaps in the eastern counties where the sustainable intensification story works terribly well. We also wanted to make sure this worked for upland farmers and farmers elsewhere in the UK. But it also talks about maintaining an export capacity. So it's business savvy as well as agronomically savvy, I think.
Yeah. I mean, Becky, as Sue was saying there, this would have implications for the whole landscape across the country. And I know that you formerly have a woodland trust hat on, so I'm interested in your view from a trees perspective as well. But what would that landscape change look like for you on the ground?
Well, I mean, I should say, first of all, that, we really welcome this report. We like the fact that it's got a kind of a radical view of what we need to do. And we love the fact that it has a kind of a whole systems approach, because that feels really important. When we at the RSPB look at kind of, what are the big systems that we need to change in order to stop the massive decline we're seeing in biodiversity around the world, then food and farming is absolutely one of those systems. So we love the fact that it takes that kind of systemic look at things. I suppose from our perspective, our view would be that we need more nature-friendly farming. So, when you look at the decline in biodiversity, the farmland bird index is one of the ones that's showing that kind of huge decline over the last 50 years. And if you think of birds as a kind of canary in the coal mine for the whole of nature, you can see that we need to kind of change something. And there are specifics here. So the kind of increase in ecological infrastructure that comes with this system, the kind of reduction in pesticides, and that return, as Sue was saying, to a kind of a mixed farming approach, would undoubtedly all be beneficial to wildlife. We have our own farm, Hope Farm in Cambridgeshire, which is about 180 hectares arable farm. And we've been farming that for about 20 years, looking at whether you can still have highly productive farmland, but do it in a much more nature-friendly way. So that's kind of hedgerows, ponds, really looking after your soil, all of that approach. And there's a farm wildlife website that we think sets out the sorts of measures that farmers can put in place to still be productive, but absolutely farm more to help wildlife as well. But I think, our view would be that kind of nature needs the right resources to thrive across all kinds of landscapes, and that might look different in different places. So, high nature value landscapes, can also mean getting the grazing levels right to allow things like curlew and lapwing to thrive. We've seen huge declines in their numbers, and curlew indeed, and lapwing actually in some places feels right on the edge. So, if we were able to deliver this approach, with this mixture, I mean, I'm not sure that we would completely concur with the kind of amounts that are in each sort of element of the plan. Okay. We've got our own kind of work going on at the moment, which we're hoping will report at the end of the year to look at what kind of mix we need. But the idea that we do need this mix, and that all forms of farming can be much more nature friendly, it's absolutely required in order for kind of wildlife populations just to recover. Really, it's those, keeping our common species common, keeping that abundance going. That's where I think this can really have benefits.
Yeah, I should just say to listeners, if anyone is interested in hearing more about Hope Farm, scroll back through the episodes, and there is an episode with Georgie Bray from a couple of years ago, but I know things have moved on since then. What about implications for conservation generally if we were to go down this kind of model? It's in theory freeing up, in inverted commas, a lot more land for conservation purposes. But how might it implicate conservation generally, Becky?
So much of our land is farmed in the UK. So, changing the way in which we farm to be more nature friendly would have, huge positive impacts for biodiversity. I think when we look at there's a kind of nature chapter in this report, and I think our only criticism would be that it of course comes from an absolutely farmland perspective, a farming perspective. So it talks a lot about kind of how nature and ecosystems support, a good kind of farming system. I think from our perspective, we also come very clearly from the place where nature and species have an intrinsic right to be here and to be thriving. So we would bring more of that angle to things, I think, as well. I think in terms of the kind of the land that is sort of talked about as being kind of freed up for nature in this report, I think we would have, as I said, a few concerns about whether that is enough. And we're still working on that, so I can't provide you with an answer, but just kind of a question mark. Absolutely, we need to do it. Is it enough? in order for nature to kind of be restored and recover. And just a slight kind of feeling that in the report, it sort of feels as though a lot of that might be in the uplands. And I suppose from our perspective, we need to kind of be looking at all habitats in order for nature to recover. So, it's just about where that is, I suppose, from our perspective as well. But I think the idea that there is this continuum, so you've got, from our perspective, you've got at one end, you've got this kind of highly productive but nature friendly farming. You've got a lot of kind of high nature value farmland as well, where you're really kind of doing that kind of mixed farming, extensive grazing and so on, and then this freed up land. That kind of overarching model, I think, is one that we would absolutely concur with. It would just be around the amounts and whether you can get those real kind of nature friendly systems running across the whole lot, I suppose.
Okay, Sue, do you want to just follow up on that point from a landscape and conservation point of view?
I mean, I agree with Becky fundamentally that all land matters. And that's why we really like this approach, because we're not kind of focusing our attention on rewilding, the land sparing debate, as it's sometimes called, rewilding the uplands with huge implications for upland communities, but intensifying the heck out of the southeast. We think all land matters, and it's possible to farm in a much more climate and nature friendly way right across the landscape. But that is still a continuum.
Yeah.
And there will still be places in the UK where it is much more appropriate to restore ecosystems really quite energetically, and where sustainable intensification with things like vertical farming close to towns, and really redeveloping those parts of the country which can produce more fruit and veg, more horticulture, healthy and sustainably produced for the centres of populations, can be developed more thoroughly. But I like to think that every single farm will be able to restore and develop and sustain really thriving natural systems with more nature on every single farm, restoring hedgerows, restoring copses, restoring peatlands, water features. So we get that really delightful mix of habitats everywhere.
I think if I just come in there, Ben, because
of course.
Sorry, you're not giving me a chance to ask you a question, but we've just done some really interesting carbon and nature mapping across the UK. We've done it for peatlands, and we've got more to come in terms of woodlands and and salt marsh and so on. And it's really interesting, of course, how closely those things overlap. So there are definitely areas of the UK which can absolutely, if we get them restored for nature, they can deliver not only for nature but for our whole climate agenda as well, in terms of sequestering carbon and so on. So I'd love to kind of overlay that work once it's complete with this kind of approach, and you start to see areas where there would be absolute benefit in freeing up more land, but also absolute benefit in terms of kind of a more connected and nature friendly farm landscape as well.
Yeah. Let's turn towards diet. A key part of the IDRI model is that diets across the UK will change significantly according to the model. More vegetables, less sugar, less meat. For example, in the model, we're seeing a tripling consumption and sevenfold increase in farmed areas of pulses, for example. But how likely, Sue, do you think is this to happen based on current projections?
Well, there isn't any serious commentator at the moment saying that diets don't have to change. That is a consistent feature of all serious work thinking about climate, nature, and the public's health and well-being. So that's absolutely consistent. I think the right question is, how do we make that happen? Because we absolutely have to. And I have to say, I'm quite curious about this idea that it's not possible to make people change their diets, because big companies spend a great deal of money on their marketing spend, persuading us to do that all the time. I mean, pulled pork. Who knew about pulled pork just 5 years ago? So the idea that people don't want to change or can't change is a mistake. Actually, I think people do want to live healthy, lives. People don't want to be struggling with the impacts of diet-related illnesses like obesity and type 2 diabetes, as well as costing the country an enormous sum of money, £12 billion to the NHS alone. It has a huge impact on people's quality of life. And we know right now that if you're overweight or if you're suffering from underlying chronic health conditions, you are much more at risk of struggling with and suffering from coronavirus. So changing diets for health and well-being and for climate and nature is not really an option. We have to do it. And the question is, how do we go about doing it? Government has an enormous role to play in that. And global governments have an enormous role to play in managing the power of food businesses to stop making and promoting foods that we know are bad for us. Now, we will argue that that's largely ultra-processed foods, foods that have a package with ingredients that few of us recognise without a chemistry degree, and we need to be eating much more fruit, veg, nuts, pulses, meat and dairy from sustainable sources. So I don't think the question is whether we can. We absolutely must. And the conversation needs to be how we start making that happen.
Yeah. I was on a webinar last night about gut health, in a very middle-class way. And in that, we were talking about dietary change generally. But the conversation started to err towards what that means for farmers, what that actually means to landscape change on the ground. I mean, from a meat perspective, what would a radical reduction in white and red meat production mean for farmers on the ground? And I'm interested in both your perspectives on this. But Sue, can we start with you?
Well, you're right to say that our report focuses on the role of ruminants in healthy ecosystems and as a part of a healthy, sustainable diet, extensively produced ruminants, grass-fed ruminants. And we do focus our attention much more on the monogastrics, on pigs and poultry, who particularly intensively produced pigs and poultry, who rely really heavily on things like imported soy. So we can have a whole conversation about how we export our environmental footprint, but we perhaps won't go there today. For farmers on the ground, integrating ruminants into rotations becomes a real prospect, I think, for arable farmers. And for upland farmers, it provides a more attractive route to market. You're producing high quality, grass-fed, extensively produced, sustainably produced red meat, which evidence seems to be suggesting has a really positive impact on health. I'm a livestock farmer. I'm an organic livestock farmer here in Wales, and we are also members of the Pasture for Life Association. And I'm very interested in some of the research that PFLA has been undertaking on the beneficial impacts of increased omega-3 in pasture-fed ruminants, and the impact that has on the microbiome. So the relationship between soil health, ruminant health, crop health too, frankly, because we're also talking about better quality fruit, veg, and crops through high quality soils. All that has a relationship with our health and well-being through our own gut microbiome. It's a branch of science that is very underdeveloped. We've not yet asked those questions of science, do the research for us on our behalf. I'm using the kind of generic we there, but we're increasingly realizing that this is a whole area of research that really would benefit from investment.
Yeah, I mean, Becky, if meat consumption were to change radically, or at least in the ways that the report and the IDRI model is suggesting, what impact would that have from your point of view, from where the RSPB is sitting? Yeah,
so I think, our position is that we need to eat less and better meat, and that's not, we're not unique in that. I think, again, the systemic approach of the report and saying that kind of diet is absolutely crucially part of the picture, we would absolutely concur with. I think from our perspective, it's about getting the right balance of incentives and regulation and a fair market, basically. Those are the three kind of red lines that you need to get in the right positions in order to ensure that farming businesses can thrive, but can produce that meat in a nature friendly way. So those are the things we need to get right, which is why we've been putting so much effort into the Agriculture Act and ELMS, and trying to get the land management system right and trying to get it moving in the right direction sooner rather than later. That feels key to us. So it's about making sure that kind of producers who might be producing in a more polluting way or unsustainable imports, they shouldn't be allowed to undercut those operators that are farming in a way that kind of adds up to the kind of systemic approach we want to see. And key to us is that those producing kind of those kind of public goods, such as really good habitats for wildlife, should be well rewarded. They should be allowed to thrive. So it is about getting all of those things right, I think. And I think it's entirely possible, actually. But if we don't get that incentivization right, and if we don't get the regulation right, then we won't get there. It will need that very firm steer, I suspect.
Sue, do you think this model completely puts to bed the whole feed the world, yield is everything argument? Should that just be a thing of the past now?
Well, I think I would like to see that. I mean, we have always known that the world already produces more than enough food to feed 9 billion people. It's just terribly wasted and inequitably distributed. So in the West, we are in general eating at least 500 calories a day more than we need, whilst people in the developing world are not getting the right range and quality of food that they need. So we already produce more than enough, but we're producing the wrong things in the wrong ways. So the report that we produced for the UK is also part of a global movement. So we're not alone, of course, in having these big conversations. They're rife in Europe and they're rife throughout the world. One of the wonderful things about ORFC was how it brought that global movement for more sustainable farming systems into the room with us. So we were able to meet and talk to farmers who are also looking to develop these sorts of practices in their own countries. So this is a global conversation. It's part of a really quite a serious global conversation about the kinds of food and farming we need for the climate, for nature, and for all people on the planet and other living systems. It's a little bit contested because there are other people and institutions who have somewhat different views, but it's a big and important debate, and the evidence I think that we're helping to amass, along with many others, is really starting to shape and shift that debate.
I want to briefly go towards the social and cultural side of change, because ultimately, really, what you're talking about here is habitual behaviour. It's how you change those personal habits, but also wider cultural habits as well. This is what we're talking about. I mean, it's the choices of the individual that really matter. How do you bring everyone along with you with your ambition?
So I think it's about creating the right conditions for that to happen. You're right. It is about lots of changes that individuals make, but I don't think we should ignore the fact that we all make choices in conditions created by governments and by businesses, as I said earlier, who spent a lot of money persuading us to do things. People wouldn't have huge marketing departments if they didn't think they worked. So I think you're right to say, and Becky's highlighted this too, we need multi-pronged strategies, which are about raising the regulatory baselines, shifting regulation around the world, about very focused education, but it's also about movement building. The thing that I'm loving at the moment are the number of farmers that join us on our podcasts, on our media channels to talk about what they're doing, and they just infect everybody who listens to them with their passion and commitment, which is also really practical and straightforward and down to earth. So I think a bit of inspiration like that, backed up with creating the right conditions, help shift the dial towards where we need to be.
Let's turn towards the pace of change. So let's work with this date of 2030 in mind. And you've both got great experience in various cases of how you take an idea and how you shift that over time into reality. In your view, what are the small things that you can start to do that begin to enact change? So with that data 2030 in mind, I spoke to Vijay Kumar a couple of weeks ago, absolutely inspiring guy in India, working in Andhra Pradesh in southern India, doing really exactly what you're saying in many ways. And in 4 or 5 years, they've began to engage very large numbers of farmers and farm workers and individuals. And as far as I can see, the difference that they have there at the moment is that they have an absolutely fundamentally clear plan on a governmental level, and they're enacting that. We're already in 2021. When will the transition begin for you? And critically, can it be done without this overarching, probably government-led, but necessarily need to be single conversion project? Or is it okay to have multiple different movements going on and converging? That's a long question and lots in there. But if we can begin to unpack that, Becky, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think there are whole books written about that.
There are indeed.
I think from our perspective, we need government absolutely to continue their commitment to public money for public goods, and to absolutely see that through and give producers the confidence they need to then adapt their operations and business models. So you're right, that is absolutely fundamental. And I think you need lots of advice available, and that needs to be kind of freely accessible, and take into account sustainability from a business perspective as well. It needs to be accessible across the whole kind of system. And I think peer-to-peer learning is absolutely key, and that is always the case, I find, in farming. And it's just so important to kind of have that trust, I think, in terms of how this movement builds. But we absolutely need an open and inclusive debate. When I think about kind of the work we do, we've got Big Garden Birdwatch coming up this weekend.
Yeah, it'll be last weekend. It will just happen when this comes out.
Yeah, you will have done it, Ben. But it will, amazingly, we've got kind of just hundreds of thousands of people signed up to it. A huge increase on last year. But the key for us is to take people on that journey from sort of loving the robin in the garden and kind of enjoying and taking solace from kind of the birds around their homes, on that journey through the doorway into what's going on in the natural world here in the UK, globally, and therefore taking action to kind of to turn that around. And that is the kind of doorway we want people to walk through. And I think it's not dissimilar to this sort of situation. You have to take people from the food on their plate in front of them on that journey and through that understanding, and that's the way you build a movement, and a movement is what kind of pushes a government to really see something through. So from our perspective, that is what is required. We need action on all of those levels, but that's how you kind of really build change, I think.
Sue?
Absolutely agree with that. This is movement building, and it's amazing how movements give governments confidence to be brave and bold. So the sorts of things that we're doing to help build that movement is to work with ever larger groups of farmers, increasingly on landscape scale projects, to start entering into some really rich pilots for demonstrating how this works, how we get from where we are to where we need to be. And there are lots of farmers coming forward who are really enthusiastic and excited about doing that with us. That's the first thing. The other important part of this whole, if you like, change ecosystem is the role of finance. So we hear over and over again that there is lots of capital who want to support a transition towards more nature and climate friendly agricultural systems, but they struggle to find investable products. So the other report that we launched in January, the Farming Smarter report, in fact we talked about that at the Oxford Farming Conference, sets out a route map for crowding in private finance, funds and foundations to support the transition to agroecology. When we made that recommendation in our 2019 report, we thought that would be a bit of a kind of, eye-catching, bold report that nobody would really take seriously. But we have found really significant numbers of very serious players who want to also invest in this transition. So with a grassroots movement of farmers who also want to make the change, with a government who is kind of finding its way to creating the right conditions for that in policy terms, to private finance willing to invest in that change. I think we're starting to see a real inexorable shift, real critical mass for change starting to build around what we're talking about here.
And Sue, just finally, before we go, I want to ask you a question that you asked Chris Howe from WWF during the launch event. What is the appetite of larger business to come to terms with what you're calling for, and how do you encourage them to change their practices?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
It's always great when you get a question back to you that you ask, isn't it? I hate it when people do that.
Yes, but I think that is the really critical question, because the truth is, our UK agriculture system is absolutely embedded in a huge, interconnected, interdependent, global agribusiness system. And many of the players who've probably got most impact on what we do are global, and some of them don't even have shareholders. Some of them are private businesses which aren't even amenable to shareholder action. But I think that's one of the things that matters. I think it's for shareholders and customers to start shifting their money, shifting their power to those sorts of products and organizations who are doing the right thing in the right way, not just greenwashing, not just kind of, sticking a picture of a plant on the front of their plastic wrapping on the ultra processed product, but who are really digging deep and making the transition. Now, governments raising the regulatory baseline can help. We've heard when we talk to global businesses, big businesses, they say to us, it really does help us if governments raise the bar, because it's much easier then for us to have that conversation that we need to have with our shareholders about what their expectations can be. But the other big question, I think, is where the stranded assets will be in the future. The conversation that the energy companies have had to have with their shareholders, with governments and with citizens about the value of those businesses, if actually what we have to do is leave oil in the ground and not hoik it out, is not a million miles away from the conversations that we need to start having with some parts of the global food system, the chemical companies, and companies who are making a fortune out of producing those ultra processed, highly packaged foods. Shareholder conversations and those big pension funds and funds who manage our shares have to be having those conversations about where those stranded assets may lie in the future if we start to see the shifts that we know we need to make.
Well, frustratingly, that is all we have time for today, but a massive thank you to my guests today, Sue Pritchard and Becky Speight. If you'd like to read the FFCC's Farming for Change report, you can find it at ffcc.co.uk/library. Next time, I'll be speaking to Wiltshire-based mixed farmer David Butler about his life and business. But until then, have a great week, and I'll see you next time.